Welcome to Conversations with Barbara. I'm Barbara Kanellopoulos, and my guest today is Betsy Gladfelter, who has been leading the Coonamessett River Restoration Project. Welcome to the program, Betsy.
Thanks, Barbara. It's always wonderful to be with you.
Yes. Now, we say the Coonamessett River Restoration Project, but I think that there is that may be a little misleading. There is not just one project, I understand.
No, in fact, while we've been doing the Coonamessett River Restoration Project the last more than 10 years, we very early on decided that this was an opportunity to talk about the history and natural history of the river valley while we were doing this project. So it's sort of two parallel projects, but they interrelate with, obviously, interrelate with one another.
And so the other, what have you called the other project?
So the other project is the Coonamessett Greenway Heritage Trail. And so it's a network of trails. You can walk all the way from Dexter's Mill Crossing in the south up to Coonamessett Pond in the north. You know, the quickest way, the shortest way is like 3.5 miles. Through the whole network of trails, if you explored all the trails, it's about 9.5 miles of trails in the Greenway.
That is extraordinary. I think our residents are going to have to plan a whole day at the site. And by the way, you have mentioned before that there have been many collaborators in this project.
That's right. And I think that's a good way to start about these two projects and to sort of highlight sort of the local contributions. And later on, I have some specific highlights that we'll talk about. But this is a Town of Falmouth project. The Conservation Commission has worked with the town and put out the contracts for this project. And so for the river, we have about $4 million in grant funds. And then for the Greenway, an additional $1 million of funds. But in fact, the project itself goes back further than 2009 when we started this process. And it in fact goes back to the state and local and federal fisheries biologists who in the 90s were concerned with the health of the diadromous fish run. Herring is the main one.
Yes.
And so in the 2000s, there are two groups that played important roles and continue to play important roles in both these projects. One is the Coonamessett Greenway Trust that in the early 2000s began to do monitoring of number of fish, et cetera. I'll tell you more about their projects. And then the 300 Committee, again in the early 2000s, began strategically acquiring property either for the 300 Committee or for the town along the river, which now has made almost an entire greenway from Coonamessett Pond down to Dexter's Mill Crossing. So by a greenway, I mean you have buffering lands to either side of the river that protect the river habitat as well. So those two groups, plus the Town of Falmouth, many different departments in the Town of Falmouth have contributed to this and continue to contribute to these projects.
And you think of this not only as a collaboration with the entities you mentioned, but also you said that the community, the residents have a role to play.
They have a huge role. And so when I think of this project, and in fact, when we've written grants to obtain money for this project, one goal has always been coastal resiliency, and I'll talk a lot more about that later, but the other is community resiliency. This is an opportunity for people to help develop a healthier environment, and they can contribute in many different ways. And so our goal is to have public access for all ages and all abilities, and also to cultivate a sense of stewardship so that people can take part in this. And in future years, for instance, well, it already happens, when people get to the Dexter's Mill crossing sign, which has a picture of migrating herring, those herring were made by second graders 4 years ago and put in a big poster, and it was part of Jane Baker's high school art project.
Yes,
and
yes, I remember.
So people, this, lots of people, this belongs to us all, but many people have a personal involvement.
And then when you speak of stewardship too, I would think that would involve everyone understanding that there's a respect for the environment, and one must not do anything to despoil that, with which overuse and carelessness can happen.
Exactly. To appreciate it, one of the big, Jessica Rittenauer and I gave a talk at the request of the Municipal Vulnerability Program to the Southeastern Health Officers Association meeting. And I'm like, how am I going to pitch our project to the health? And then I thought, I know what I'm going to do. The 300 committee it's been shown that people getting out in the environment is important for their health. It's good for their physical health. It's good for their mental health. And so Jessica and I worked together on that project. So you're right.
Yes. People turn to nature for, let's not talk about the restoration of nature, for restoration of their selves.
Exactly.
This is what nature gives us. It occurs to me too that you mentioned one of the collaborators, the fisheries people have got to be delighted at the estimate that 70,000 river herring migrated up the river recently.
Well, right. Well, that's what, unfortunately, because of COVID, we didn't have an official count this year, but that is the count. But our goal, we have much higher goal than that. This river used to have a herring run of over 1 million fish. So we're hoping within the next couple of years. It takes a while because the fish have to get up to Coonamessett Pond. They have to make their babies. The little babies have to get back out into the ocean, spend a couple of years, go back up again. So it'll take a little while to get a bigger population, but that's our goal. And that's happened in many restorations throughout the world where they've done river restorations and taken dams down.
Yes.
The migrating fish come back.
I would assume to me that this is a good sign. 70,000 is a sign.
Yeah, absolutely. So I might just switch to what are the coastal resiliency benefits. And so the next thing I just want to mention to you, for those of you who go and visit the river soon, the Coonamessett River Trust has put together a wonderful little brochure. It's a 2-sided brochure, and it's a self-guided tour to the restoration. And it's available in their kiosk, which is just down the road, off John Parker Road, opposite Clark Street. So if people would like to, if they listen to this and then they say, well, I'd like to look at more, I'd like to see more detail, then they should do that. And it's like a 1-mile trip, and it points out the features that I'm going to tell you about right now. So the project itself, the Coonamessett River, is a groundwater fed river. So if you go from Coonamessett Pond, which is about elevation 33 feet, 3 miles down to just past Route 28, where the river goes into Great Pond, it's 0 elevation. So in a little over 3 miles, you've only gone up 33 feet. So it's a very shallow valley, but it's broad and wide, and groundwater is flowing into the river. There's more of a flow in the south part of the river because of these groundwater contributions to the river. And so what happened was, back thousands of years ago, and even hundreds of years ago, this was a wild river. And it was a wild river that the local Native Americans used for food, for trees growing by the river were used for shelter, and so forth. But when the Europeans came in the 1600s, land use began to change. The needs of the people, the earliest people who came here, they needed food and shelter and an economy. And what they did was they dammed up the rivers for mills. Mm-hmm. And so in 1700 at Dexter's Mill Crossing, Dexter built a mill, the first grist mill in Falmouth. But what that did was that blocked the river. So it impeded the fish run in the river. And for 200 years behind, when you cross Dexter's Mill Crossing, you stand there and you think, for 200 years, from 1700 to the late 1890s, you would have looked up at Factory Lake. It was a mill pond that was behind that dam. And then in the late 1800s, the Swift brothers bought the land. The mills went elsewhere to bigger rivers, mm-hmm. and those river bottom lands were turned into cranberry bogs. And what happens with cranberry bogs is cranberries grow better if their feet aren't in the water all the time. Yes, so you sand the bogs, and that lifts them up above the water table.
Right.
But from the role of wetlands, wetlands like to build a surface, a layer of soil that's called hydric soil that helps remove nitrogen and other pollutants from the soil. So basically you completely altered the function of the wetlands.
Right. But Betsy, this is so interesting because it seems to me that what you're saying, this is kind of like a little object lesson. It appears that we act before we know. The Swift brothers could never have known that their actions would have, well, unintended consequences for future generations, nor Mr. Dexter and his mill. They must have been so proud of themselves for what they were doing. They must have thought of that as progress. Then we look now back and we think it was despoiling the environment.
Well,
of course, we didn't need the mill anymore. We didn't need the cranberries. So this gives us, this whole restoration project gives us a really interesting slant on social history.
Well, right. I mean, to look at land use history, it's hard to look back at something. And what I always think of was, I lived in the Virgin Islands for a long time. And the largest, at the time, the largest oil refinery in the Western Hemisphere was on St. Croix. But to build that refinery in the 60s, they completely destroyed what was the best mangrove forest in the northeastern Caribbean. But I, coming in the 70s, recognizing that it was the Hess oil refinery, that was the heart and soul of the economy of St. Croix. And so, you can't really judge what people have done in the past, but we can learn.
Yes, you can learn. And historians do say that we judge the past by the context of the past.
Exactly. And it was people needed to put roofs over their heads and
Exactly.
food in the mouths of their family.
But it's wonderful then that we're able to restore, we're able to put nature back so that it begin to heal itself.
That's right, and that's exactly what the process is. It was from our perspective, it seemed like it was a long process, 10 years, although other people say to me, it's amazing all this happened so fast.
Yes.
I said, well, I think it's amazing too.
Yes.
But so the project, not all the groups, other groups contributed over time, but the town, Coonamessett River Trust, the 300 Committee, and especially the Division of Ecological Restoration, who worked with us right from the beginning. This project all began in 2009, but there's a lot of work that has to be done before the contractors come, before the big machines appear. And so you need to have engineering plans, and then you need to have permits. And in order to have permits, you have to have additional studies of different kinds. And that all takes time. And during that time, we slowly were able to get a grant here, 2 years later, another grant, 2 years later, another grant. And then we had enough background material. We were successful in getting a big federal grant whose goal was to restore habitat. And that was our first big NOAA grant.
Right.
So that enabled us to actually start construction on phase 1 in the fall of 2017, and that was completed in spring of 2018. And while that was being done, and then through 2018 and part of 2019, we completed the engineering phase, the engineering of phase 2 and the permitting of phase 2 and getting the additional money needed to do phase 2, so that we started phase 2. We had our kickoff in October 2019, and we've just finished phase 2. Now, the parallel,
yes, go on.
The parallel project, which is with the Coonamessett Greenway Heritage Trail, we're working on that as we go along. And so as we get a little further in the talk, I'll tell you where we are and what's coming up.
I've heard you use the expression sleep, creep, leap.
I think I might have this right towards the end, but the sleep, creep, leap comes from one of my best friends here in Falmouth, who I've known since I've been here, who said to me, you plant something in the ground in Falmouth, you put a plant in the ground in Falmouth, and the first year it sleeps. Mm-hmm. The second year it creeps. The third year it leaps. Well, I've said to people, not in my yard. Each of those phases takes a couple of years.
Yes.
But in fact, projects are that way too. So for, probably 15 years, people had the idea that, we should think about restoring this river. Mm-hmm. But then we started in 2009 applying for grants. And for the first, we got 2011, we got a grant. 2013, we got a grant. 2015, we got a grant. And two of those were small state grants. I mean, 50 to 75,000. And the first was Fish America, which is funded by NOAA. But they're kind of what I call, it's little seed money to get you started, to get the group growing, to get the momentum going, to get enough information to be successful for a larger grant application. And then even when you get that, you still have to finish all the permitting before you can start construction. And so we got the big NOAA grant, so over $1 million grant it's big for us, in 2016, and we were actually able to start construction in 2017. So it's.
Yes, well, and also yes, I can see the leap is coming at the right time, because with this growing concern for climate change, the idea that with improved coastal resiliency, it's got to be a huge benefit.
Well, exactly. And that's the thing when you apply for these grants, this project and many such projects improve coastal resiliency. They improve flood storage. They improve the function of the wetlands. They improve habitat for federally endangered species. They do all of those things, but whoever you're applying for, you have to kind of fit what it is that they wanted. And so the last big grant we got was the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Grant, and we fit into the category nature-based solutions.
Excellent, excellent, that's wonderful.
So just to, well, I'll go through the elements of restoration, because when you go out there, well, I can tell you the question that everybody says is, what are those vertical tree stumps?
Yes,
and we'll get to that in a minute. Let me just start with the river channel itself. So the river channel, going through these bogs, is meanders are added to the river channels, so that the river was about 1.4 miles long, and now that river channel is almost 2 miles long. So we've added distance to the river. And what happens is, number one, there's more habitat because it's a longer river now, and it's a more complex habitat. So when you go out there, you notice that there are places where it's shallow and it's moving fast over rocks. And then there are places where it goes more slowly. Then it goes around a bend, and the outside of the bend has a big pool underneath. And the inside of the bend is a more depositional environment. So I have a picture that compares what it looked like in 2014, this is phase 1, versus 2018. And what you can see is the river in the lower bog is almost 1.5 times as long as it originally was. And then I show you a picture, a wonderful picture, actually. It looks like it's from space. It's from a drone that someone flew and allowed us to use his picture. And what it shows is the middle bog during this phase 2 restoration. And it just looks like it's all mud and water. And it's while they were building the new channel, over to the right-hand side, which is the right-hand side is to the east of the river. You're looking upriver, you're looking north. What they do is they build a bypass channel. So the river itself can continue to run free, while in the middle of the floodplain, the new channel is built. So then you wonder, well, how is that new channel built? Well, the channel, now this has all been designed ahead of time. So the channel is dug out in the pre-designed area. Some of the older channel is kept, some new channel is built. The channel is built so the river will be more narrow than it originally was, but in places much deeper. And so along the sides, so it's big equipment that's used for this. Along the sides of some of the channel is put this fabric cloth, which is, they're kind of new terms, they're river restoration terms. This fabric cloth is called FES, fabric encapsulated soil. And within that fabric cloth are seeds specifically to stabilize the banks in those areas. So then I also show you a slide of the design of the upper bog channel. And there are 3 things that we're going to talk about there. One is, when this new channel is dug, there are also side channels to very strong springs, these groundwater springs. And this is so that if the main channel becomes warmer in the summertime, which it does, it's going to warm up, the side channel will have fresh cold water coming into it, but also a fish in the main channel, like a brook trout, which is one of our goals, to get a brook trout population, a thriving brook trout population. Brook trout can go into those side channels, and some of those side channels will serve as nursery areas for the brook trout, spawning areas. And then John Parker Crossing, I'll talk about that specifically. But what I want to show you is what I say, the deeper pools, which are, it looks like pickup sticks. And when I first saw it, I thought, oh, well, you kind of haphazardly put those logs in place. Now, this is logs that are horizontal on the surface of the, well, it's not just the surface. The logs actually are 3 layers deep.
Pickup sticks for some giant.
It is pickup sticks. That's exactly what it is. And these machines are giants, and they're very precise how they put them. So Nick Nelson, who's the designer, is out there when they're doing this, and he makes sure that it's exactly where he wants it. And facing the river are root wads, the roots of the trees, and the upper part of the trees extend back into the floodplain. But those layers, and the next picture shows you those layers stack up, and they leave holes. And you see my hands. They leave holes between them that those vertical pieces that you see, those what look like tree stumps, are pounded in. So the whole thing connected makes like a 3-dimensional mesh at the outer end, which will anchor those parts of the river for who knows long, decades, maybe centuries.
It strikes me, I want to know what kind of science does one need to know to plan that particular thing that you just spoke about? Where does that come from? And
well,
what discipline?
So that's a great question. So the person who designed this river, who's also worked with us for 10 years, is with a company that does that. And the company is called Interfluve, meaning between the rivers. And he introduces himself as, and this is what he is, a fluvial, meaning a river, geomorphologist. And geomorphologist means the shape of the earth. So he works on how rivers are shaped.
Fantastic. Think of how specialized our sciences have become, that you need to say that a fluvial geomorphologist.
Yeah, you've got it.
Right.
But in addition to that, well, Nick's a great guy in addition to that, but he's also a very keen natural historian, and he knows his birds, he knows his turtles, he knows his fish, and he's a very avid outdoorsman. And so, but it's pretty specialized. So there are a few more slides that actually show this in action, and I have a slide that says, yes, it looks ugly at first. It looks like a big mud hole with the big, and these trees with root wads also have there's a special acronym. They're LWD, large woody debris. And it shows Nick there in the mud. Nick loves the mud, and he's waiting for the big equipment to come to place those logs precisely where he wants them. And then around that area, the next picture shows the fabric encapsulated soil, which further stabilizes that area. And then the last picture shows what that river looked like a year later. when lots of plants have come, which I'll tell you about the plants in just a minute.
Yeah, wonderful to be able to have those pictures to be able to visualize this process.
Right, but the best thing is for you all to go out and look on your own and take the self-guided tour. So this is just this is sort of the lecture, but the field and lab part of this course, you have to go out and do it on your own. So
there's much to learn. While we're speaking about acronyms and initials, I have noted that one of your contributors is T3C. Who
right.
is that? What is that?
The 300 Committee.
Oh, of course, Falmouth's own.
Falmouth's own.
For whom we are so grateful to have given us so much over the years.
Right.
So
the next part about how this makes it a more resilient community, there's when we take down, so we took down for phase 1, we took down Lower Dam. For phase 2, we took down Middle Dam, and we improved the passage underneath John Parker Road. And how that helps resiliency, coastal resiliency, is that these are long linear ponds on the south part of Falmouth that end up in these what are called spring sapping valleys. If there's a big hurricane, there's going to be a big rush of water up those ponds and up into those valleys. So by removing the dams, it allows floodwaters, it allows additional, floodwaters to get further up those valleys and do less destruction further downstream. But the other reason it's important to have those dams removed is, and I always, if you're with me on a field trip, and I'll do this to you, Barbara, we're going to get to Dexter's Mill Crossing, and we're going to stand there and we're going to talk about the channel. I'll talk about the channel, and I'll say to you, okay, now where's the river? And people always kind of look at me like, this is probably a trick question. So Barbara, where's the river? Can you show me the river? You think this is it? You think this is the river?
Well, it certainly is the widest part I've seen today.
Well, it's the river channel, but this is all the river.
All this was river?
Yep, from shore to shore. These are coastal banks. All of this is river.
That's amazing. And all this green, simply
all this green. So if we were standing on the dam that was here until a couple of years ago, in the early 1700s, you'd be looking at a lake. So for 200 years, Factory Lake was backed up behind this dam.
Really?
Then Factory Lake was drained, the mills went elsewhere, and then for 100 years, these were cranberry bogs, and they were sanded year after year. So this part of the river, to either side of the channel, was buried by water for 200 years and then by sand for 100 years.
And all these plants?
Then we removed the sand, and except for the taller bushes that were planted, everything else came up from seed that was buried.
Amazing, amazing. All that green life buried.
Yep, just ready to come up. So the outside bends, so in this area, this phase 1, there were 8 new bends created. And they were created by these big trees that have the roots still on them. 3 layers of big trees piled on the outside of the bend like that. And then between the holes, vertical pieces are set in. So basically it makes like a basket mesh.
Yes.
And that's protecting this outer bend. Hundreds of years from now, the actual channel might change. But initially, this is the channel, which was not exactly the way it was 400 years ago, but very similar. Oh, see that? Muskrat.
Oh,
And obviously the river's running right underneath us, right? The channel.
Yeah,
But
yes.
the river is the whole floodplain. It goes from some coastal bank to coastal bank on either side. Those are actually coastal banks, even though you're, a mile from the coast, because potentially floodwaters could come up there. But that whole area is the river. And even though you can't see the water is percolating downstream through all that soil.
Really.
So,
And when you speak about protection from hurricanes, we hear that hurricanes are going to be, the future ones are going to be ever more stronger and more frequent than in the past, which is part of climate change. So this is happening just in time for us.
exactly. And the other aspect of connecting that floodplain is, as sea level rises. So one of our most important, they're all important, but one of our most important marine resources are salt marshes. But as sea level rises, those salt marshes where they exist now will be drowned, but salt marshes will extend further inland. So the other aspect of resiliency is that this is providing potential habitat for migration of salt marsh, so that we'll still have salt marsh, but it'll be, further upstream than it currently is. So the next thing is that sand is taken off the surface of the wetland. For 100 years of cranberry farming, every other year, sand was put on the surface. So over time, that sand built up. And actually, when you dig into it, you can actually see layers of sand. And most of that sand was removed from the surface of the wetland, putting the wetland down at the level of the water table. And that excess sand was put into where it came from in the first place, the borrow pits to the side. And then what happens is the surface that remains is roughened up. It's made into what we call pit and mound topography, so that there are higher spots and lower spots, which means if you're a plant and you like to have your feet wet all the time, you're going to live in the lower areas. But if you're a plant like a pine tree and you really don't like to have your feet wet very much at all, you're going to be on the top of a mound. And so you have all these different habitats, all these different microhabitats, which will favor the success of different plants. And so that diagram shows that this isn't exactly the kind of, it doesn't show the river. This was for a different kind of cranberry bog, but the same thing happens. You take out that layer of sand and you get down to the water table surface. And then I have a picture that just shows our construction crew. We met from the beginning of December till 2 weeks ago. We met every Wednesday at 9:30 in the morning to talk about the schedule, what was done last week, what's going to be done next week, what issues, who needs to coordinate with who. Obviously that changed with COVID-19, and we had to switch those to telephone meetings. And unfortunately, until this past week, our representatives from Division of Ecological Restoration, who have been with us all these years, they couldn't visit the site once COVID started. but now they can. They've both been down and very excited to see what the results were. But the people who were on site on our last day of meetings, I asked if everybody would come for a picture, and I asked a friend who's a good photographer to stand on Swiss Crossing and look upriver. And so that's the picture, the phase 2 construction meeting. That's actually our masked picture. I asked him to take a second picture. So there is another picture where you can see most of our smiles, but basically we're 6 feet apart.
Yeah, yes.
So just to finish this pit and mound topography, so that we're standing on Middle Dam, and Middle Dam came down, was taken away. A couple of days later, it didn't exist. And so the next picture shows looking from east to west across Swift's Crossing. And on the left-hand side, the downriver side, you see a couple of people enjoying the little area where people like to take their dogs. And that was phase 1. On the right-hand side, you see what looks like lumpy mud, and that's phase 2. And those are the pits and mounds. And then the last picture in this, well, next to the last picture, shows one of the big machines making the pit and mound. And finally, you get to the point where did these plants come from? The company planted some trees and bushes, and they put seed on the coastal banks to the side. Everything else that came up from seed that was buried for 300 years, 200
Really?
years underwater, 100 years under sand. So
Yeah. We're talking about heirloom seed.
that's right. That's right. And I took our town manager, Julian Suso, one time, and I told him that, and he said, it's like a time capsule. And I said, that's right, Julian, that's what I'm going to call it. And that's what it is.
Mhm.
So I'll just say one more thing about that. So Coonamessett River Trust has these wonderful programs that people have been involved in. The fish counting, they help with the Adopt a Fish, which has been very important, and I'll talk more about it when we talk about working with the school children. But another program that Chris Neal has sort of taken under his wing is Chris and Pam Poloni and Don Shaw from the Botanical Club of Cape Cod and the Islands. They've been keeping track of the plants that were in the area. And what Chris has been able to show, Chris has set up quadrats. This is 3 feet by 3 feet sampling areas that he can go back to the precise area. And he counts all the plants, the different kinds of plants, and how much cover of each plant. So what he's found was there were about, say 75 total in these 40 quadrats, 75 different species when he first did this before restoration. Now there are like 135 species, and they're almost entirely native plants. And where they're not native plants, where they're invasive plants, we're controlling those.
We should probably tell viewers that Chris Neal is with the Woods Hole Research Center. I think he is the leading scientist. I'm not sure what his
That's
title
right.
is.
He and Linda Deegan is also there, and Linda Deegan is a fish ecologist specialist, and she also works on salt marshes. And the two of them have been instrumental. Chris in this plant program, plus he also is working on looking at the effect of the restoration on reducing the nitrogen load in the river.
Mm.
And Linda has led the project for tagging the fish. So, you know, it's one thing to know how many fish are coming. The other is, you might hear the kind of questions you might ask that they were able to answer. How long does it take a fish to get from Dexter's Mill Crossing up to Coonamessett Pond? Well, if you're really swift, you can do it in 5 hours. When there were barriers there, though, some of them took days to
Yes,
make it up.
yes, right. It seems to me that this whole project is yielding lots of very important information for scientists to be using on other projects.
Exactly, it is. And so, and we have the Coonamessett River Trust to thank for doing all those studies.
Oh, good.
And some of us in this project work with people in Eel River, that's a town of Plymouth project, and with Tidmarsh, which was a private ownership, and the people who owned it started basically a scientific study of how restoration, what happens in a restored habitat, and they started an organization called the Living Observatory, which is specifically looking at the scientific outcomes of restoration,
Oh,
with the
that's
goal,
great.
yeah, with the goal of trying to incorporate what we learn as we go along.
That's great. And of course, I would imagine that Gary Anderson's group, who are working on the Childs River, will have much to learn from the Coonamessett project.
Right. In fact, I said to Gary, I mean, Gary and I have been in close contact since when he first had this idea, and they've done a remarkable job in moving it along. They'll be starting in the fall.
Yes.
But the one thing I said to Gary is, and this is about a year ago, I said, just let me warn you, Gary, everything's going to take twice as long, and it's going to cost twice as much.
Yes, always.
So the last part of the restoration, the last big element of the restoration, was putting in a new culvert, or culvert/bridge. It's called a bridge by Mass DOT standards, at John Parker Crossing. And for those of you who go there, and when I took somebody yesterday, she said, well, this doesn't look like a very big bridge. I said, no, you look at it now, and it looks like you just put 2 pieces of wood across and put a road surface. But the next couple of pictures that we're going to show you show that this was a much bigger project than that. So in order to have that new bridge, they had to do 2 things. They had the river channel itself going through a bypass. But remember, I said the river is more than just the channel. It's this whole breadth of groundwater that's moving in to the system. And so in order to actually put the bridge itself in, they had to dig this giant hole. And you can see in the picture, those men are all 6 feet tall. They had to dig a 15-foot hole and pump it free from water so they could put the footings in. So I just have a few pictures that I show you. The first is putting the footings in. The next picture shows the cranes, and they had to have two large cranes lifting up these precast pieces of concrete, setting them into the footings, bolting them together with sidewalls, and then it was all done. And you could look on April 2nd, you could look upriver, and you could see that the anchored banks on either side, and then you could look downriver. And then the final set of slides of the bridge is, I show you what it looks like looking north and looking south, before and after. Before, there was these little deteriorating pipes, and downstream, upstream, it had this huge contraption. And then now you see what it looks like. Now, kind of a fisheye view of what it looks like after the bridge was done. And then the last picture in that set is, I'm very lucky that I'm a friend of Joe Netto's, and Joe doesn't live too far from here. And Joe very often would walk down in an evening and show me, you know, what he could see, what progress was taking place. And so very soon after the bridge, after the fish started coming up, he took me that picture of it's probably 100, but he saw several hundred herring migrating under the bridge. So it was very exciting.
Shall we bring our viewers up to date to let them know what still lies ahead?
Well, as far as the Coonamessett River Restoration Project, that part's done. We're the final paperwork for the grants. We're working on it now. I'm very lucky that we have a wonderful accountant in town, Vicki Rose, and between the two of us, we've sorted out. It was very complex because we had for this project, we had actually 5 different sources of money, but some could only pay for some items and some could only pay for other items. So every month we would have to figure that out. But what is still going on, and what I'd like to talk about next, is the Coonamessett Greenway Heritage Trail.
Yes, and that's going to be, that's ADA, that is for disabled people will be able to.
And I think, trying to think.
Yeah,
I have some pictures. So I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But I want to start out by saying the 300 committee, and in particular, Allison Leshen, who was a volunteer with the 300 committee, she and I, so I've thought about this trail for a long time, and I knew the kinds of panels we wanted, but you know, that's easy to say. You know, these are the subjects, but then you actually have to design it and put it together. And Allison is like a marvel, and she came up with the basic design, and she came up with the colors for the different kinds of panels. And then she recruited 3 other colleagues from the 300 committee who give a lot of nature talks. And among the 5 of us, we put together these, when it's all said and done, 27 different interpretive panels. And we have all the ones along the river installed now. So if anybody wants to walk either the upper river, the mid river, or the lower part of the river, you'll find some interpretive signs and you'll learn something new about Falmouth.
That's wonderful. Are they encased in glass? Are they?
No, it's a hard
plastic?
Plastic.
Rosin.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful to be able to read those as you're there, looking at the landscape and reading about what was happening. That's wonderful.
Right. And actually it was fun the other day. I mean, it's fun for me to see people stopping and looking at them. But somebody came by the other day and said to me, "You've got to go up and look at that sign. They talk about the migration of the American eel. You're going to be amazed." And I went, oh, okay, that's great. And that's just what we wanted people to think.
Yeah.
So I have a few slides, which you'll see as I'm talking. And in January, we put the first set of slides in. And again, this is where, you know, this is where the whole community comes in. Mark Kaspersik and Chris Bennett both work for the town, Mark for conservation, Chris for engineering and DPW. So the 2 of them have helped a lot in this project. So they helped the 300 committee. Alex Zolo coordinated with the AmeriCorps. So we had a dozen AmeriCorps kids come, and we really thought, you know, it'd be really nice to have an auger to dig some of these holes. I mean, they can be dug by hand, but George, we asked well, a bunch of us know George Patello. Well, actually, I met George in the street, and I mentioned about this project, and he said, "Let me know. I'll come and help." So George came, and in one day, we put in the signs starting at Bartholomew property, and then all the way up to Coonamessett Pond. And then recently, Chris and Mark and I put the other signs in. So I have a couple of slides. One shows the sign with Chris and AmeriCorps at Coonamessett Pond. We have a sign about, various signs about the first Europeans that came in the mills and cranberry bogs and so forth. And then we have a sign, and actually David Vieira suggested this, and I have to say it was one of the most fun signs for me to do the research on at the historical museums in town and also in New Bedford. But it was the Portuguese island contribution to Falmouth. So that was a fun one. But I also wanted to have one about the Wampanoags. And so I have a friend, Lucinda Keith, who has many Wampanoag friends. And she said, well, let me ask what they would like to do. And so the sign that we have there is, what do herring mean to the Wampanoags?
That's wonderful.
And it's actually written by Joan Tavares Avant, Granny Squamet, and Vernon Lopez, Chief Silent Drum, who's in his 90s now. So Lucinda said, now that you have the signs in, can I take Joan out there? And I said, yeah, I'll meet you. And so that's the two of them. But I also wanted to point out, and this is another amazing aspect of sort of what kind of a community we live in. So I told you the 300 committee has this Adopt a Herring, and they allow each spring, they couldn't do it this year, but they'll be doing it next year. Each spring, you can pay $10 to adopt a herring, and then you can name your herring. So you can name it Alfie if you want. So then you can go online and you can see, they'll tell you that Alfie's been tagged. And then you can watch every day and see how far Alfie's made it. Has he made it up to Coonamessett Pond? How long does he or she spend in Coonamessett Pond? And then sometimes you can see Alfie coming back down through it's like through Easy Pass. They have a little tag and it goes through a little sensor system.
What a wonderful gift that a grandmother can give to her grandchildren.
Exactly. And what's happened is various groups like the Rod and Gun Club have actually paid money for school groups to be able to adopt them. And the first group that did this the first teacher who took advantage of this was Lucinda. And Lucinda incorporated the tail of the herring, not only the biology and ecology of herring, but also the history of herring use with the Wampanoags and over time with her third grade class from Borndale. So that was, she was able to incorporate it into using various aspects of science concepts she wanted to get across, and in social science.
Yes.
By doing something the kids could actually watch and follow on their own. So I knew that, and I was asked by Jane Baker, who's the high school art teacher, would I be willing to work with the second grade class? So Lucinda started 2016, so 2017, I started working with the T-Ticket second graders, and Jane also incorporated the art part in it. And so that's why we have that spring herring migration.
Yes.
And so then the next year, people contacted Coonamessett River Trust, and it's the Falmouth STEM boosters that have this green bus tour for all the fourth graders in town. So for the next 2 years, and we plan to continue this, part of the green bus tour is to stop for an hour and a half at the river, and somebody's gone to the class ahead of time, but then the kids have a field trip at the river. So it's just been all these, oh, and the Woods Hole Sea Grant is also part of that. So all these different community groups have pitched in, to contribute their part to these programs. So it's been fun.
Yes, I can see why you call it. It's total, and it represents the diverse community. Everybody, many hands involved. That's really, it's quite an inspiring story.
Yeah, and it's it's always nice to be. I think back to a lot of things. I used to give a talk about how lands get protected. And I've given this a couple of times, like at Sea Education Association. I used to live in the Virgin Islands, and I would have a map of St. Croix. And I'd start with 1940, when there were 2 little areas that were protected lands. And then by the 2000s, there were like 30 areas that were protected. And from the 1970s on, which were probably 25 of those 30 areas, I remembered when those areas got protection, and I played just a little part in it, but it makes you feel good. Even though you aren't the main person, you could play your little role in saving this. So then there are a few other slides of the signs that are up now. And then there's like an overhead shot of the gateway to the Greenway and the Lower Loop Trail. And so off John Parker Road, there's going to be a parking area. It'll have room for about 20 cars, but also, which is critical, is school buses have had to stop on John Parker Road. And although it's supposed to be 30 miles an hour, there are some people who exceed the speed limit. And I always worry because some of them don't stop, even though the school bus has a big stop sign out. And so the school buses are now going to be able to just come in and safely drop the kids off. And then from the parking area, which is about 30 feet elevation, or I think it's 28 feet elevation, down to the Lower Loop Trail, there'll be a wheelchair accessible trail that goes down to the lower trail, and the entire lower loop, and this is thanks to a generous contribution of the 300 committee to the town, the entire lower loop will be ADA accessible. And then the next picture, there's going to be a river overlook, and basically it's going to be a walkway, an elevated walkway that comes out from the parking area. And that's what that next picture shows. And that will all be done, that work will be done later this fall and winter. And then finally, the part of the ADA trail that's on the west side of the river was completed last week. So the ADA pathway is completed on the western side of the river. And Mark told me that even though it's not completed on the eastern part of the river where you have access to it, some people have already gone and taken some of their family members to there, and which is great. I mean, this is just why we want everybody to have access to this area. And then I just have a few pictures. It's been, this is an area for people all over town, especially people in the neighborhood go every day, but it's a nice place all along the river to go out for a walk. It's a great place to lead field trips for students. People bring their dogs. People take wildlife pictures. And I have a few. Another one of these stories about people contributing. I saw someone probably 6 or 7 years ago, I was giving a trip out there, a field trip, leading a field trip for people from Sea Education Association. And I met somebody taking wildlife photographs. And so I, stopped and talked to him, and I said, we're going to be doing this project in a few years. Would you be willing to let us show some of your pictures? And he said, yeah, I'd love to have that. And so his name is Phil Beach. He lives here in town. And so there's a picture that I say a few of the animals to look for. And he's just a wonderful photographer, and he's willing to share this with all of us. And we shared it with you on the interpretive sides.
That's wonderful.
All I have left is sort of a summary of what the climate adaptation benefits are, which I can go over if you'd like.
Yes, I think we talked about some of those benefits.
Yeah, so the goals were for a naturalized, self-sustaining wetland. So we remove the barriers, and we remove sand off the surface. And the way we describe wetlands sometimes is they act as a sponge. If there's excess water around, they act as a kidney, and they take out nitrogen and other pollutants. And they also can store carbon, what we call their blue carbon environments. This self-sustaining wetland also has increased biodiversity of plants and animals in these habitats. And one of the importance of that is if there is a flood, when the waters recede, those seeds are still there in that, seed bank, and they'll come back. That environment will come back. And then the floodplain connectivity, again, allows 3D water movement. Water can move down the valley. Water can move horizontally across the valley, and water can move vertically through the wetland soil. And also it's important for salt marsh migration. And finally, we improve the fisheries. Increased habitat complexity. It moderates the temperature in the side springs and with buffer plantings. And in addition to the herring and the American eel, we're hoping to increase the brook trout population, and the real goal, and I always say when this happens, I can stop this project. I can stop my participation in the project. The real goal of our freshwater fish biologist, Steve Hurley, is to get a population of salter trout. Steve reintroduced brook trout to the system, native brook trout, probably 6 or 7 years ago, hoping that he might be able to establish a population. And for a year or two, he added a few more adults, but now they're doing well. They're reproducing. We have, many different age classes now. And he's also seen that they have moved downriver. He hasn't, I don't think he'll tell me whether they've become salter trout yet. And salter trout, the Coonamessett River was a favorite place for fishermen in the early 1900s. They would come from Boston, and as far as Boston and New York, to spend a week here fishing for salter trout at the mouth of the Coonamessett. So, yeah, so it's exciting. It's exciting to have these, improvements to the natural system, and to provide an opportunity for our young people to learn more about it and to appreciate being in nature.
Yes, absolutely. This is a huge story, a success story for future generations, for us right now. And I know that if people want to take tours, are you leading any tours? You've done this a lot, I know.
I have. Yeah, I'm always, the problem, like right now, we shouldn't really have group
That's right,
tours.
we should, right.
And actually somebody she's another prominent town meeting member, called me about a question the other day, and she said, so what are you doing? You mustn't have much to do. And I said, well, actually, I've been pretty busy. We're finishing up the river restoration, And she said, is there any chance you take my husband and me on a tour? So I'm actually going to take her on Monday. Yeah, if somebody wants to call up and have a tour, I'm happy to give them a tour.
For the moment, I had forgotten that we have social distancing, but this is just wonderful. And I'm so pleased to have you explain all this. And we should, all of us individually, celebrate this wonderful story of the restoration of the Coonamessett River.
Thanks, Barbara. Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
I just want to thank all of the people who have contributed, and I just find it amazing. But in particular, I just want to point out, and I'm hoping to get an opportunity I'm going to ask Megan if I can make this statement when I have to go before the Board of Selectmen in a couple of weeks on something, to just say how much I appreciate all the contribution from the people in the town of Falmouth. Somebody said the other day, I think Betsy works with every department in the town. And I said, well, maybe not every department, but almost every department. And people have been wonderful. And I've had the opportunity to take many of the people who I work with out for field trips too, yes. Which has been fun.
Yeah, I think we can think of Falmouth, can think of the Coonamessett River as our Coonamessett River.
Absolutely. It's our town project.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank viewers for tuning in. And I know that you will enjoy hearing all about this and watching the slides and the photographs that will come along with Betsy's explanation. So thank you, Marilyn, for directing the program, for making this possible. And everyone out there, stay safe. Thank you very much.